Hi, I am Solon Barocas. I have the pleasure of introducing myself today. I am a postdoctoral research associate here at CITP, and today I will be talking to you about some work I've been doing on my own, but also a little bit with Arvind Narayan, who is here as well. And it's around the topic of inference and how do we think about the privacy implications of inference. So the title of my talk might be slightly peculiar, hard to parse at this point, but hopefully it'll become pretty clear as I go through. So this is sort of a reiteration of my abstract, but it gives you, I think, a decent sense of the problem I'm trying to work on. So what I say here is, like, the devil is not just in the details, meaning that there are ways to infer additional details, additional facts from the base facts. And that lets us do all sorts of interesting things, things that are actually quite difficult when it comes to privacy. So it could be that we're able to glean facts that haven't been disclosed explicitly by the person, to make guesses about certain characteristics that can't be observed directly, or to just simply avoid the need to get information that has been disclosed to someone else by buying it or somehow working with a data broker or whatever it might be. And that these are kind of well understood, long-standing problems, of course, because inference is just a basic mode of reasoning. But in a way, this issue that inference poses for privacy has become much more complicated with machine learning, in part because machine learning has really taught machines how to draw inferences on their own. And so that poses practical challenges for privacy, which I'll describe, but it also poses some really interesting problems for the way we even reason about privacy at all. And for those in the room who may not be so familiar, although I doubt anyone in this room isn't, just as a kind of very high-level description of what machine learning does. So in a way, machine learning is this subfield of computer science that's really devoted to automating the process of discovering useful patterns in large data sets. And the discovered patterns can then be the basis for decision-making, often automated decision-making. So in a way, machine learning is can be doing two kinds of different automation, automating the analysis, and then the results of that analysis can automate subsequent decisions. And some terms of art that might be useful as I go through the talk are learning and model. So this process of kind of drawing lessons from historical data is called learning, the machine learning part. And the accumulated set of relationships that you've discovered is commonly known as a model. So I might just use those terms throughout. OK, there are, at this point, maybe this is the most, by far, seminal example of this problem. Does anyone happen to, well, maybe before reading the text, does anyone happen to even know what this is based on the cover of the article? OK, so this is like the now very, very well-known, well-cited story by Charles Duhigg in the New York Times Magazine about Target's pregnancy prediction score. In particular, Target was trying to figure out if the purchases that consumers made were sufficiently informative that they could make reliable predictions, inferences, about which consumers were likely to have a child within the next 3 months. Right? And in the story, Duhigg tells us that when someone suddenly starts buying lots of scent-free soap and extra big bags of cotton balls, in addition to hand sanitizers and washcloths, it signals they could be getting close to their delivery date. So this is just a kind of example of how inference works, but it has become the kind of go-to anecdote for basically every discussion of this sort. And I can say much more about this, and I will. But there's also now, I think, a seminal academic paper on this topic. And this is work that was done by a group at Cambridge, which looks at your Facebook likes. In fact, this is a screen grab from the website that they've set up. So if people are interested, they can even just go to the website. The research basically shows that by looking simply at what you like on Facebook, you're often able to make pretty powerful inferences about all sorts of demographic features about the person, but also additional things like psychographic details. In fact, I think I will show you what those are right here. You probably won't be able to see.
Whose work is this?
It is, I'm going to forget the name. Does anyone remember the name? Arvind, do you remember the guy's name? If you look up this website, you will immediately find the authors of the paper. Sorry, I should have had that on the slide. So you won't be able to see this, but basically these are reporting the accuracy rates for the inferences that can be drawn by just simply looking at what people like on Facebook. And for some of them are pretty amazing. So for gender, it's at 93%. And well, this is an area under the curve, so it's a specific kind of measure. But for the sake of discussion, it makes sense to think of this as accuracy. That race can basically, with this categorical, mean white or black, can be at 95% accuracy. And this is simply just looking at what people like, right? So this gives you a decent sense of the power of inference using what might on its face seem like relatively benign, innocuous information. This is a different set of inferences they make, which are kind of continuous variables rather than categorical. And here they're kind of basically trying to predict, how intelligent someone is, their emotional stability, kind of personality traits, right? So again, pretty surprising and unsettling stuff. The one I thought was actually really interesting here is that they're able to predict better than chance if your parents were separated or not at the age the person was 21. And to give you a sense of how this works, the authors of the paper present a somewhat misleading but nevertheless helpful table which kind of shows which likes end up being the basis for a reliable prediction about this particular trait. And in this case, I've just pulled the table from the prediction about IQ. And it shows you what you might think are not terribly surprising things, like if you listen to Mozart, that ends up being a pretty decent proxy predictor of high IQ. And then it also shows you some incredibly upsetting and depressing things, like if you like Tyler Perry, that it's predictive of low IQ, right? But I'll come back to this also again later.
Loving being a mom is like low IQ.
Right, exactly.
That's
right.
Like super.
Right.
It's a Facebook group, right?
Yes.
Most people have never read Bourdieu, right?
Right. So I'll come back to this exactly. Yes. Yes. Okay. But I offered these just to kind of provide some kind of foundation for the discussion I'll have now, which is somewhat wedded to these examples, but I'll hopefully go much further beyond them. So what I'll say is that I think the primary focus of the debate about inference in privacy circles has really been about the degree to which inference making undermines the kind of practical techniques we have for ensuring privacy. So what that has meant is that how does Fourth Amendment fare in the face of inference, right? So if you can infer all sorts of things from base facts, then that might mean that the information, the protection that Fourth Amendment provides can be severely compromised, right? Or it could be that the FIPPs, which is all largely based on a kind of notice and consent regime, likewise is much less effective if I agreed to give you this information, but I didn't realize that many inferences that at the time weren't obvious to me could be drawn from them. And there's a whole entire literature that I'm sure this room knows very well about how inference, in a different way, also has begun to try to chip away at anonymity. But what I'd try to point out here is that really it's not so much why this kind of discussion, although very important, really hasn't been on why the inferences in and of themselves actually amount to a violation of privacy. Rather, it's describing how they undermine the efficacy of the tools we have adopted or developed to protect privacy. And as far as I'm concerned, this really is a matter of confusing the method we have for protecting privacy for what privacy itself is, right? These are not the same things, and I'm going to try to argue that it's actually very hard to explain why inference actually amounts to a violation of privacy, not just why it's difficult for our tools. But to start, I kind of want to point out that the status of inference itself is actually pretty uncertain in a lot of these discussions, and I'd like to often start with this relatively long quote from Aleister Crowell, who is, are people at all familiar with Strata, like the O'Reilly conference on big data? It's one of these massive, it's in fact probably the most important industry conference that helped kind of proselytize around the term big data. And Aleister Crowell was one of the people who helped start it. He also tends to write sort of these, kind of blog posts that take a, a slightly interesting view on topics. And so I'll just read this and give you and I tried to pull out important details. So he says about inference, much of what we see as technology's invasion of privacy is really just prediction. As we connect the world's databases, tying together smartphones, loyalty programs, medical records, and other constellations in the galaxy of our online lives, we're doing something that looks a lot like invading privacy, but it's not. Big data doesn't peer into your browser history or look through your bedside table to figure out what porn you like. I should point out that this actually comes from another story in the New York Times that described how political campaigns were using interest in pornography to figure out your political leanings. So this is just like a kind of reference to some other work. Rather, it infers your taste in smut from the kind of music you like. Big data doesn't administer a pregnancy test. Instead, it guesses you're pregnant because of what you buy. It's prediction and invasion of privacy. Not really. We're simply taking the inefficiency out of the way we've dealt with risk in the past, right? So, OK, let me just stay here before I go to the next one. So this is like a very clear statement that basically says like all the traditional ways of violating privacy don't apply here, right? And because they don't actually involve, peering into someone's private space or like an intrusion into some kind of private area, this really can't amount to a privacy violation just by definition, right? And interestingly, this is another quote I'd like to use. So this comes from a New York Times story on in-store tracking using Wi-Fi. So they asked a number of consumers their reaction. People I'm sure are familiar with this. They're able to stores are able to see who's coming into the store, how they navigate the store by looking at how their phone communicates with the Wi-Fi hub. So the story involved interviews with consumers, and one consumer says, well, the creepy thing isn't the privacy violation, it's how much they can infer. So what I like about this is that the consumer, and actually Kroll himself, are sort of making a categorical distinction between those sets of activities that actually amount to a privacy violation and inference. And these are not the same thing. And in fact, inference, by definition, cannot be a privacy violation, right? So I kind of want to trouble this, though. And again, what I want to say here is that this actually confuses what have been the traditional mechanisms for enforcing certain information flows that respect privacy norms for the norms themselves, just as we had in the case of people describing why any violation of, let's say, the FIPPs automatically amounts to a privacy violation. This is the same reasoning, but the absolute opposite conclusion. It basically says that because it doesn't actually involve all these traditional ways we understand privacy to be violated, either through peering into someone's private space, looking over their shoulder, because it doesn't involve those things, yet again, it cannot be, not yet again, in the opposite way, it can't be a privacy violation. So this is a kind of confusing situation. And in particular, what makes this difficult, I think, is that it reveals that, well, first of all, there's confusion over like what even amounts to a privacy violation in its own right, but also identifying some normative basis for why something is a violation. And I'll try, for the remainder of the talk, actually work on this specific question. Like, what is the normative basis for saying something is a violation? And before I really get into that in any meaningful sense, I need to at least address what I call inference as a non-starter. So there are a number of people who basically argue that this is a fool's errand, that talking about inference as a privacy issue makes no sense. Even if they were to recognize that there might be some kind of privacy implications, because inference is an irrepressibly and natural impulse, right? That we all make inferences all the time, and in many instances, we can't even be prevented from making those inferences. It's just the way we actually interpret the world, right? So Altima Tlie has a nice piece on this, if you go along with his reasoning. But there's an even more, I think, extreme version of this argument, which has to do with fears of inviting regulation of reason itself. Meaning, if we allow inference to be perceived as a threat to privacy, we are in some sense inviting people to pass regulations that would restrict inference, right? And because inference is so foundational to our way of thinking, this then ends up being kind of a limit on people's freedom of thought. And so Jane Bamber and Eric Siegler say essentially similar things coming from a very different perspective. Jane is a legal scholar. Eric Siegler wrote a popular press book on analytics. And they both basically arrive at the same conclusion, which is that this is so foundational to the way people think that it doesn't even seem practically sensible to say this could be regulated. But yet again, I kind of want to say that this entire way of reasoning rests on what I think of as false parallels. So I think what should be clear about all the arguments here is that no one's actually arguing that inference does not pose a problem for privacy. I think they would all acknowledge that it does. What they're trying to say here is that even if that's true, we shouldn't do anything about it because of all these reasons. But I want to argue that this is really, I think, a sleight of hand, and actually is very similar to a long set of arguments in privacy debates, which many people might be familiar with. So to begin with, right, what they are describing often in their work are these in-person interactions where the inferences are being drawn on the basis of factors that are really evident to the person themselves, the person that's subject to the inference, and that the people would have very good reason to see as being a reliable basis for inference making. So in Altima Thlie's case, he describes a butcher making inferences about the likely tastes of his customer and whatever products he sells at the store, right? And because that's just how commerce works, that's how all commerce should work, right? But this is not the way things work anymore, and it certainly doesn't work that way in machine learning. And the parallel, well, the history I'm trying to point to here is the very familiar argument that says, well, if I can observe someone's comings and goings on the street, what is the difference then with installing a surveillance camera in that same space that allows me to watch that person's comings and goings, right? These are functionally the same thing, so we can't actually object to the surveillance camera, right? And what I want to say here is that similar argument is being deployed here, and we have to actually begin to push back against that. And in particular, I think machine learning is a break with the past in even more fundamental ways than the ones I was just describing, which is you can, using machine learning, draw lessons from large data sets automatically, and then subsequently apply those lessons automatically as well and en masse, meaning that all the inferences that were shown about your personality in the Facebook like study, those things can now be applied to all users of Facebook, right? But you can also discover ways of drawing inferences that don't rely on factors that you perceive as relevant to that quality, meaning I might be able to draw inferences about your personality by looking at things that on its face, for me, for many people, for most people, would seem totally unrelated to that trait, right? And then finally, machine learning also lets us sort of extend the range of qualities that we can reliably infer, meaning that this is not just a matter of automating those tasks that humans performed, right? It's not just the butcher now being automated. This is actually a whole new set of inferences that can be made reliably. So I think this actually really poses some difficult problems. Oh, that was for me. Yeah, so for instance, right, like I was mentioning this earlier, I doubt anyone could meaningfully predict by looking at what people like on Facebook whether their parents got divorced or not by the time this person was 21, right? This gives you an impression of like how you can actually extend what is reliably inferable. So given these differences, are there ways at least to begin to kind of adjudicate when inferences that do follow these forms are objectionable and when actually are they not? And I'll describe 3 intuitively attractive ways of trying to resolve that. And then I'll try to explain why I think all 3 have problems and then develop this somewhat harebrained scheme to explain or to kind of overcome some of the challenges I described with the other 3. OK, so surprise. Surprise might actually seem like the most intuitively attractive, meaning something that's objectionable, an inference that is objectionable is one that I find surprising, right? Like, oh, I didn't predict you could actually guess the fact that my parents got divorced, right? And many people have begun to develop this idea of surprise. In fact, the placeholder that people use for like this practice is creepy. So people have called like the target case creepy. Often, if you look further, the creepy is defined as basically surprising, and it's not a very rich normative explanation, normative account. So let me just though explain first of all why, as an explanatory basis, surprise is not so satisfying. So first, not all inferences that are surprising actually are perceived as a violation of privacy, right? So I can make all sorts of incredibly powerful inferences about whether or not some transaction is fraudulent in ways that I would never be able to predict, but I see that as perfectly fine, right? There's nothing about that is a violation. So simply being surprising is really not enough there, too. And it's also unclear what surprising would mean, right? Does it mean it's surprising because it was not obvious that such inferences could be drawn? Or was it surprising because it was not obvious that such information had been collected in the first place? So what I mean by this is like, especially when it comes to these Fourth Amendment cases, if I have a huge amount of observations of you, and I'm able to figure out that, I don't know, that you're in Alcoholics Anonymous, right? And the way I do that is by kind of tracking every single place you go. That is not a terribly surprising inference in the sense that if you were to show me the facts that you relied on to make that inference, I would recognize obviously how you were able to do that. It would be self-evidently the case, right? That's very different, because what you're really surprised by in that case is the exhaustiveness of the observations that you were able to collect. You're not necessarily surprised that from those observations you were able to draw this inference, right? And so what I'm trying to make a point here is that this is really, I think, crucial in thinking about this kind of first issue about, well, no, sorry, let me backtrack. This is like very important as a way to distinguish between cases where the objection really is just one that's about the exhaustiveness of the data collection, and one that's much more like narrowly targeted on the inferences that are being drawn, right? And so I think there's a whole category of inferences that can be reduced to a much more familiar problem, which is really about the exhaustiveness of the data collection. And there are many ways of then handling that, whereas there's a other set of inferences which are really not just about that, right? And then finally, it's also very possible that inferences that it would be impossible for a human not to make, meaning like I couldn't help but infer certain things from your appearance, right? It would be surprising if a computer did it. And it would be surprising and objectionable if a computer did it, and along the lines I was saying of the Facebook study. So surprise here, like, is not a very satisfying or a simple approach. And finally, as a normative standard, meaning as a way of trying to say when you will do this in the future, how to go about it in a normatively defensible way, it doesn't fare very well either. So what I would say here is that as a standard, basically all you're suggesting is that just make sure the person isn't surprised. Just make sure that you've told them that I'm going to subject them to this inference, right? And that actually says nothing about the appropriateness of the inference. It just simply says the problem is that they're uninformed. And there can be many, many cases where actually telling the person that they're going to be subject to this inference is actually worse, because it can affect their behavior and their way of living in the world. So it's not really clear to me that this is a great way of doing things. OK. So moving on to sensitivity as a different way of trying to account for why an inference might be might be objectionable. So I'll have this discussion by talking about 3 different cases. So the first is FICO medical adherence score. So FICO is the company that developed the credit score, but they're now a kind of general analytics company, and they do all sorts of scoring, one of which is for medical adherence. What that means is, can we predict if this person is going to take their drugs as prescribed? Will they, in fact, complete the dose? Will they be regular in taking it? And interestingly, this is the single greatest cost in the medical system, which is actually remarkable. People failing to actually take their drugs as prescribed is the single greatest cost. So a really serious problem. And somewhat remarkably, FICO was actually able to do this pretty well. And now many people rely on it. Other companies like Express Scripts, who is the provider for, I think, Princeton, they use the same technology, not FICO, but they have developed their own stuff in-house. But the difference between FICO and Express Scripts is actually really important. FICO does this not by looking at anything related to your health-related habits or your previous medications. They do it by essentially looking at the same information they would look at for making your credit score. So this is not information that, on its face, has anything at all to do with health, right? And when this was when this was first released, it got a fair amount of media attention. And in a story in the New York Times describing how this worked, it was actually kind of interesting, because in the comments, basically everyone was objecting to this practice, because they thought, how is it possible that FICO can kind of make predictions about my medical behavior without looking at my health records, right? And so there was just a profound disconnect between this idea. And so basically what you might think of here is like, OK, this lesson, like the lesson we can draw from Target, is that something might be sensitive whether or not it was observed directly or inferred, right? So it's not that the underlying information has to be sensitive. It could be the inference that you're making is about some sensitive property, right? And I'll get back to that in a little bit. But generally speaking, this was the lesson drawn. This was the primary lesson drawn from the Target case. It was saying that it doesn't make sense to just think of sensitive information as being attached to specific items that we already know is sensitive. We have to recognize that seemingly trivial, benign information can be the basis for making an inference about something sensitive, right? Okay. But then let's turn to GINA. GINA is the law that basically prohibits discrimination on the basis of genetic information and employment in other areas. And GINA is interesting because it actually singles out one particular type of information for regulation. It says genetic information should not be the basis for hiring decisions, let's say, right? But this is actually a kind of interesting case because it begins to, I mean, if we think about the power of machine learning, we have to begin to ask about why certain information is even sensitive. So one thing to first of all recognize is that the past, 20, 25 years has shown that the kinds of expected returns on genetic information haven't really panned out, meaning it's much less powerful as a basis for inference making about certain facts. And at the same time, there's increasingly evidence to show that you can make inferences about precisely the same things you thought you could only make with genetic information, but you could do it by looking at things that are actually quite trivial. Meaning I can just look at what people's consumer shopping habits are and make inferences about things that are basically more accurate than the inference I'd be able to make by looking at genetic information. Right? So what this basically then begins to say is that, like, why do we carve out some special category for genetic information? And the answer might be, well, because it has such obvious consequences, negative consequences for discrimination, right? But if there is other information which is available everywhere, basically, and collected as a matter of course, that has the same effect, then what does it even mean to say that there's like this kind of category-sensitive information? So then you might say, okay, and this is actually a move that the online advertising industry has taken. You might say, well, no, really, sensitivity of information is a function of its potential use in consequential decisions, right? It's nothing inherent about the information itself. It's in how it might figure into consequential decisions, right? And this, intuitively might seem like a really nice way of solving the problem. But it has somewhat bizarre outcomes. So this comes from the White House report that kind of proposed a Consumer Bill of Rights. This report is, I guess, from 2012 at this point. This is what it says. This is the language from the report. It says, companies engaged in online advertising should refrain from collecting, using, or disclosing personal data that may be used to make decisions regarding employment, credit, and insurance eligibility, or similar matters that may have significant adverse consequences to consumers. So immediately, I think what should be clear here is that it basically assumes that the information that will figure into consequential decisions is self-evident, meaning like this is the kind of information that shouldn't be collected because that's the only kind of information that can figure into these consequential decisions. Right? But all the stuff I was trying to talk about in the last slide should obviously make you realize that that is not true at all, right? In the sense that what could figure in these eligibility determinations now can be a huge range of factors that on its face would not at first seem like the thing that would be relevant, right? So this way of, again, trying to carve out some set of facts that shouldn't be considered in these decisions doesn't really make sense when we think about machine learning. Okay, and this final approach is what I'm calling a smell test, but there definitely has to be a better name for it. Okay. So the way I think about this is as I was trying to describe earlier, people have tended to confuse the fact that inference can undermine the efficacy of privacy law or the tools we use to protect privacy. They've confused those things for the value of privacy. And really, these tools embody norms about privacy, and we should just try to figure out ways to recuperate the norm so that we can actually appropriately limit inference. So the problem, it seems to me, isn't that there aren't norms. The problem is that inference is often a way to just circumvent those norms. Right? And we can perform a kind of thought experiment to figure out what those norms are. And so when I first, this is years ago now, when I first read the story about Target, I thought, oh, well, there's just a really straightforward way of figuring this out. You can just basically ask, is the institution inferring something that they wouldn't be prepared to learn by attempting to observe it directly, or by just asking the individual themselves, right? So if the answer to this is no, which it often would probably be, you are hitting on some kind of norm, right? And we know from the Target story that that is actually Target's own experience, right? So Target, as people may recall, actually did a kind of test run of their campaign based on the inference about pregnancy. And the mail they sent to expecting parents was very explicit about it was actually exclusively about babies, right? And people reacted negatively to this. And so then Target's solution was to essentially obfuscate the fact that it was doing this by placing information about baby products in a larger set of promotional material that were about other matters, right? So it was still trying to reach these expecting parents, but trying to conceal the fact that the real focus was on that issue, not just on a broader set of things they might be interested in. So in a way, this doesn't really tell us what the norm is, right? It just is a way of kind of figuring out whether or not the inference is in fact violating some norm. And it might seem like a very convenient way of doing things, but doesn't really help us figure out some more foundational answer about what's wrong. And interestingly, some commentary from regulators, this is Julie Brill, the commissioner of the FTC, have been along these lines, right? So I'll read this again because I think it's helpful. There's nothing in the context of a retail purchase that reasonably informs the consumer her data might be collected to make predictions about sensitive health conditions or seek her consent to do so. And if the store were to try to make the notice and consent explicit, imagine walking to Target and reading a sign on the wall or disclosure on a receipt that says, we will analyze your purchases to predict what health conditions you have so that we can provide you with discounts and coupons you may want. That clear statement would surprise and alarm most of us. So what I like about this is, and I would like to hear if I'm reading this incorrectly, but what I like about this is she's not suggesting that the solution to this problem is just introduce notice. Like she's saying that if you were to introduce notice, you would just have an immediate reaction on the part of consumers that said, like, what the hell are you doing? So she's not advocating in favor of a notice and consent regime here. She's saying the notice and consent process would reveal to us that this company is actually violating some norm, which is really interesting. I think it's sort of along the lines as I was suggesting about this smell test. But this is actually ultimately a really dissatisfying way of doing things too, for a kind of complex reason. So this way of trying to approach a problem works well if the information being sought is some sensible attribute that has a history of being sensitive. So in this case, right, in Target, pregnancy. But this is really not the way things work all the time, right? Often, what companies now do is instead of trying to infer some attribute and then on the basis of that attribute make some additional inference about how people with this attribute will behave, what they're trying to do is directly model the person's behavior. Right? So they're not like trying to predict pregnancy in order to figure out if they would be receptive to certain kinds of marketing. They're simply trying to predict who will be receptive to certain kinds of marketing. Right? And so this way of doing things presumes that there will be this sensible middle ground, this middle step. Well, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me say, OK, so why? This is a part of the story that gets less attention. Like, why was Target interested in pregnancy? Well, it knew from other research, academic research in fact, that pregnancy is one of very few occasions in a person's life when these deeply ingrained shopping habits are unsettled and when new routines form. And so Target's goal in predicting pregnancy wasn't to just kind of bring in new business from new parents. It wasn't just trying to kind of sell baby products to parents. It was actually trying to say, like, these are people we can make lifelong customers. So this was, the fact that they were focusing on pregnancy was basically a fluke, right? If there were other moments in people's lives that had this effect, they would have happily inferred that instead, right? It's simply that pregnancy in this particular case played that role, right? But it's also possible, yeah, sorry. No.
So your suggestion that companies will skip the, excuse me, the middle inference step in this case would translate to the idea that this insight on this very first bullet, that pregnancy is one of those occasions that, as you said, we know from academic research, you're suggesting that that can be inferred by the machine with as good results as scientists doing that work. And I think, you know, you should acknowledge that that's a very strong claim. It might be true, but I think it's an especially strong claim that you're making there.
Sure. So it's possible that, well, I'm not. So I'll reiterate Arvin's point. Arvin's point is saying that, like, it's not necessarily clear that machine learning would be able to learn the same thing that was learned in the rigorous academic research, right? The academic research is like trying to seek out like some causal model, probably was done in like a randomized control trial, much more rigorous result. It's not obvious that machine learning would just reconstitute that lesson in some latent representation of the data.
Exactly.
And yeah.
It could do well, but will it do as well as having that knowledge and explicitly using that attribute? That's the part I think.
Totally, and I don't have the slide here to show you, but there is actually now considerable research that shows that you can probably do better by simply looking at people's browsing history online than in actually using demographic information. So there's evidence to show basically that what you think of on its face as being much more telling, like all the demographic information about some user, is much less like useful for making certain kinds of inferences than just being able to see where someone happens to browse. And to me, that's not a totally satisfying answer to your question, but it shows, I think, anyway, that we shouldn't get hung up on demographic information just because it happens to be sensible for us, when in fact it's less useful for these kinds of consequential decisions. If that makes sense.
If I could try to, I think Arvin was actually saying, he's trying to say that maybe we shouldn't worry so much about this because machine learning isn't in the position to make this kind of the level of inference that's really that Target figured out from science. And I think what you just said is, well, we can't be sure because actually machine learning has access to information that science doesn't. And so I think I'm actually, this is sort of a question because I'm not sure, well, I think I'm disagreeing with Arvin, but I'm not entirely sure. that I think I'm agreeing that.
Well,
that
I think both things are possible. It's an interesting empirical question, right?
Yeah,
like I don't know there can it won't be a universal answer, and it will certainly depend on like the strength of the academic research in that field. Whatever. There's no universal answer here.
I'm confused as to like what you guys mean by science. Like, do you mean like can Target actually tell if you're really pregnant?
No,
Better than having a pregnancy test?
No.
I'm confused.
Arvin is saying that it's probably unfair to say that machine learning could, how do I explain this? Machine learning will learn lessons from the data, right? And conceivably, one of the lessons it could learn in a way that wouldn't be intelligible to a human is that there is this relationship, that people's shopping habits are unsettled by the fact that they've just had a child. And in learning that, it could end up having essentially the exact same effect, right? It will say, send advertisements to these set of people, but it hasn't done it by having this middle step that says, who is the person who's about to have a child? Does that make sense? Is that right, Arvin?
So it doesn't know unless the consumer knows they're pregnant. They're going to make different purchasing decisions.
But I think
So
It's not a truth claim, though. It's not trying to say that like Target or anyone can have like knowledge about the actual pregnancy of the people. It's simply saying, sorry, go ahead, Jen. Yeah.
someone who's thought about this a lot, this particular case a lot. So, and part of it is like they do this anyway, right? Like, so if you start a new college, right? Like when kids move to college is another time when like Target wants to get you in, Walmart wants to get you in. They send out flyers to the college campuses and say like, get your dorm room all set up, etc. Right? It's not really any different. Except the question is, could we have, and when you have a baby, you know, as soon as you have the baby and you put on the registry or like that you've registered your baby, then they know to send you the things. The question is, can we jumpstart that? Could we know who's going to college before they show up? Could we know who's going to have the baby before everyone else gets their products there? And so to that extent, there are certain things that even before you're showing that you know, like, and a clerk would reasonably know this too. Like if you go through the checkout, you know, when I go through the checkout and I'm buying like, you know, tampons, they might make some assumptions about whether or not I am having my period when that might not be visible to anybody else, right? So they're already making particular kinds of inferences. The question is, how early can they do that, and can they get you in the door early?
And this, your point now puts me my finger on why I disagree with Arvin. So if I could easily believe the machine learning thing could pick up on that that you suddenly change your entire purchasing behavior at the same time you buy those whatever the non-scented all or whatever, right? So it may never have to know about pregnancy and still do exactly the same behavior and start hitting you. Although of course then it wouldn't necessarily send you baby stuff, which was the problem in the first place.
Right.
Would you still be upset by that?
Right. So this is what I was going to say. Hopefully.
Okay.
No. Okay. So I took up the slide. Yeah. So this is in the paper this comes from. So yes, I think actually that we've been wrongly obsessed with the fact that you can infer someone is pregnant and comparatively like uncaring about the consequences of that inference, right? So it's the sensitivity of the inference is because there's all sorts of reasons why pregnancy might put, for instance, like women at a disadvantage in a workplace or whatever it might be. There's a long set of reasons we might care about that. But the book this comes from, Charles Duhigg wrote an entire book about this, is actually like very much in favor of these approaches. This is a critical story about Target, but he's actually very gung-ho on the ability to shape habits, right? And what this is basically revealing is that you can make very powerful inferences about people's habits and intervene in those habits, and that's also what we should care about, right? Not simply the fact that you can infer pregnancy in order to affect someone's habits. And so my argument here is that like we need to think much more about the consequences of things that don't involve this sensible midway point, but actually are letting companies model behavior very successfully so they can shape it.
But there's also an issue where, I mean, and it gets to the Target case where even if Target wasn't concerned about pregnancy or not and was, trying to skip right past that to give somebody the right set of coupons to bring them in, that piece of paper, that flyer that has all these, targeted coupons was what actually triggered everything, right? The father said, "Why are you sending my daughter all these coupons for baby products?"
Right.
Yeah,
so that's what's interesting ultimately too is that like that is an inference as well. But yeah.
That's sort of my point. Is
Yeah.
that leaks the information.
Totally, and there's actually a lot of work in computer science that just basically shows like what information is leaked in targeted advertising in general. So seeing just what someone has been targeted with tells you a little bit about what they think. Exactly. Yeah. So I totally agree. Although I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
No, it's more of a comment.
Oh, okay.
You seem to be going full circle, but in an opposite way to your first slide about the Fourth Amendment FIPPs, in that you said that what we should be looking more at is the attempt to use inferences to shape behavior. That brings it as a fundamental FIPPs violation, as opposed to what you were presenting it as a circumvention. Because when you look at the FIPPs and you think about the core elements of restrictions on collection and for secondary uses, you're talking about secondary uses. The inference is a secondary, making the inference is a secondary use of the information.
I totally agree that the FIPPs have normative values embedded in them, and when practices violate the FIPPs, we can often figure out what value has been violated as well. But it's not clear to me that every case that violates the FIPPs is actually a violation of privacy. FIPPs is a very effective way of managing activities that could have implications on privacy, but they're not the same thing. That's my argument. Oh, sorry, FIPPs. Maybe let me just continue in the interest of time, because sort of like this is the somewhat of the payoff. My argument here is that really what matters isn't surprise or sensitivity or even this kind of smell test, which helps us get closer to it but doesn't actually tell us much. It's what I'm calling social repertoires. And this is the kind of like still not perfectly well developed part of the argument, but what I'll say here is that in situations where people reveal certain information or behave in certain ways, that is obvious fodder, meaning it can really be the obvious basis for an inference. People really employ extremely well-developed and deeply ingrained repertoires of self-presentation that facilitate all sorts of discretion, right? And I don't mean this in a kind of like, let's like bring some formal description to how people manage their privacy. I mean that in a fundamental basic way of being human, we navigate a world in which we're constantly subject to inferences, and we're able to navigate that somewhat successfully. And my argument is that it's actually, ironically, through a repetition and exposure to the way that we're subject to inferences that we learn how people make inferences about us. And that the result is an intuitive, if always imperfect, and incomplete understanding of the range of inferences that we are going to be subject to. And as I was saying, right, like inference is a fact of social life. This is not something as novel in the sense that machine learning introduced inference to the world. We've always, forever, been subject to inference. But that we as humans are highly socialized into the cultural norms that assign deeper meaning to the behavior that is the basis for this inference making. And we are reasonably aware, even if we could never fully articulate, what others might make of our behavior, right? And that negotiating what I'm calling these kind of intersubjective dynamics is the nature of social life, right? And it can be a source of anxiety and stress, but it also is the way that we basically establish our relation, personal identity, and so on. And just as an example of this, this is a really important work from media studies that basically says, like, you know, the way I dress says a huge amount about me. And I know, for instance, the fact that I haven't shaved, that like my shirt is not tucked in, so on and so forth. These are cues upon which people are going to be making assessments of me. And I don't know the full range of what those are, but culture has successfully and kind of indoctrinated me into the ways in which those inferences are made, right? And that this, I think, is really what's at issue. So where certain information renders us more amenable to the judgment or influence or control of others, the information that does that lets people do that, often has these profoundly social and cultural significances. And my argument then is that it's precisely these inputs to inference that we learn to manage through this endless process of being socialized and subject to and involved in social interactions, and that we ultimately then develop this kind of elaborate set of repertoires that both limit how we make ourselves available to people, but are necessarily made available to others. Meaning, this is not a strong argument in like toward autonomy, meaning that we can perfectly control what other people know about us, right? This is saying that we live in a world in which we never have full control over the way inferences are made, but we manage ourselves successfully anyway, right? And I don't mean this even consciously. I don't mean like privacy choices on the Facebook settings page, right? I mean like social interactions where we're able to successfully negotiate our presentation to the world. Not by being able to be secret when we want to completely, but understanding that we're subject to these inferences. Right? Oh, right, OK. And so what I'm trying to argue is that what's important isn't that like we somehow grant people full individual control. Rather, it's the preservation of these patterns of social interaction that are important. So this is the kind of hopefully useful argument. The inferences that undermine the effective functioning of these repertoires, which we develop through social feedback, are those that will be perceived as violations, and particularly as a threat to autonomy, because we no longer really understand. This is it. Oh, no, I took out the slide. I'm sorry. OK, because we no longer really understand the basis upon which we are being subject to inference, and the full range of control and influence that others can wield over us because of that. Right? And so that was sort of like the normative argument. Here, this is sort of like, how do you operationalize that in some meaningful way? So some people began to think about this already. Scott Peppett and Deirdre Mulligan and Eric Horowitz, in particular, have nice short pieces. Well, Peppett's article is long. This is a short piece from Nature. Kind of drawing a little bit on Helen Nissenbaum's work on contextual integrity. And the argument here is this, I think. It says, decisions based on contextually distant proxies are those that are likely to provoke objections as violations of privacy because they involve inferences that draw on criteria that seem unrelated to the things with which they nevertheless correlate. And both these arguments, and the one I guess we could develop further, is that the reason that you want to prevent these kind of cross-context uses of information for inference or limits context jumping is because it ultimately begins to threaten the effective functioning of the context from which the information comes, right? So if I can make a really consequential inference about, I don't know, how smart you are for a job or something like that, right? How talented you'll be in a job by looking at, you know, where you happen to browse on the internet, that's troubling, right? In part because it's consequential, but also because it begins to cast a shadow over all these activities that you might be doing online that on its face seem totally unrelated to the thing that you're making an inference about. So I think that is the end of the argument. Thanks. And I don't know, is there time for questions?